Hey everyone, I'm Trent Kusters, co-founder and studio director at League of Geeks, and this is the Game Maker's Notebook. Today we've got a super exciting episode for you because I've just been chatting with Tynan Sylvester, game designer and creator of RimWorld, which I'm sure needs no further introduction. Of course, we start off the episode talking about, how he got into games, what he did as a teenager, creating maps in Unreal, mods, various things like that. But we quickly talk about his first job out of college, which was at Irrational Games, working on BioShock. We talk about the lessons learned there as a creative, working in a large studio at the end of the creative process, so to speak, and how leaving BioShock, he left filled with a bunch of opinions, which he then crystallized into a book, Designing Games. How that process of crystallizing his thoughts and philosophies on game design were crucial in his ability to then go on and create RimWorld. And we speak about the depths that Tynan went to in order to extract those thoughts for his book, including the fundamental theory of why people play games. Then the RimWorld chatter begins. We chat about the prototyping phase that led to RimWorld, particularly about being loss averse, or actually people who are loss averse and how it can be a trap. We talk about the ability to kill your darlings, about salvaging particular features or mechanics so that they can live on in future prototypes. We talk about story generation and mechanizing the principles of storytelling to create a story generator as opposed to a standard skill test style game. Then we close out the episode chatting about how Tynan handled that transition, taking Ludion Studios from a solo dev through to 20 plus people, whether that be the personal growth involved or processes, and he has a bunch of advice there for folks. There's a ton in this episode. Tynan is a game designer and a developer and a creative who has thought and written a lot about his process and why and how he makes video games. So without further ado, enjoy. Here's Tynan Sylvester.
I don't have long. You need to know what happened, how to stop it. The monolith. We came here to study it. Instead, we awoke it. Twisted creatures emerged from the void. We fought for our lives. Beasts and machines. A sphere of metallic death. But we adapted, trapped them, studied them, learned the void's secrets, turned monsters into tools, made them serve us. We were powerful. But we got too close to the horror. Fools chose to serve the darkness, doomed us all. Their filthy rituals tore open the earth. And what came out? We went in to exterminate the freaks. Down, down, down. Tunnels full of stinking meat. Found their mama. Lit everything up. Then ran. The flesh came after us, grew everywhere, covered the world. We burned everything. It's only me now. The monolith speaks in my mind. Such beautiful promises. Why not answer? What do I have left to lose?
Tynan, welcome. Thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's a really exciting episode today because, we usually charter developers course up until they've made the game. That's the reason that we've got them on the podcast. But the game has usually come out just before we've got them on the podcast, or sometimes it's coming out shortly afterwards, or maybe earlier in the year because they're in the DICE Awards. But you released RimWorld, when was it?
2013 originally.
2013, right. And so we've got almost a decade of like post-launch content or whatever to talk about and, fiddling around with the game. And it's had a life of its own after then. So I'm really excited to dig into that. But we will start the podcast where we always do, which is What is your earliest memory of video games, and how did they sort of light your brain on fire?
Um, when I was probably 3 years old, I think my brother managed to beg a NES out of my parents, and he got it for Christmas. So I managed to get access to that. And yeah, I mean, that was pretty much it. Mega Man 2, A Boy and His Blob. I remember I used to play the Boy and His Blob game before I could read. So I created this little key where each bean in the game had a different color and it would do a different thing to the blob. And I created like a visual guide for myself that showed the color and then like the object it would turn the blob into, like a ladder or something like that. I could read the words on the screen. So that's sort of probably one of the earliest memories there. In terms of creating games, I actually, around that time, probably a few years later, I used to go and take the chalk. We would draw on the driveway outside my parents' house, and I would use that to draw a giant like platformer game level. So they had a long driveway, so I would draw a tall rectangle that represented a skyscraper and a little stick figure guy at the bottom who is the player character, and then like a pot of gold at the top, like 30 feet away, and then just draw a series of platforms with like monsters and helicopters and ladders and such on them, with the idea that this is supposed to be a game like Mario or one of the NES games I played, Contra, where you could go from the bottom to the top. So I think that is my earliest memory of game design, and those are my earliest memories of being involved in gaming at all.
Incredible. Yeah. And how old were you at the time when you were, drawing your little pot of gold?
It's really hard to say. I just remember doing it. So I was probably like 5, 6, 7 years old, something like that.
Okay.
The next thing that happened, like in terms of actual digital game design, is when I was 13. Unreal Tournament came out. I think it was late 99. So I got it for Christmas and I started doing levels in that game, which was really important for me. And that was basically where I started out as. Like my first job was actually at Irrational Games as a level designer, kind of springing from that thread there.
It's amazing, isn't it? Thinking about all the devs that like just something simple like that led to. I remember, I'm primarily a console gamer because the PCs in my household were like work computers because my parents, had a home business. But the one game that kind of exposed me to even some sort of like light modding or, content creation, I guess you would say, is Age of Empires Galactic Battlegrounds. The Star Wars one had like a map creator, that you could like make your own little campaign maps and do some light scripting and everything. And
that's like the old StarCraft custom maps that we used to make as well. Back, like everyone would just make up new game modes and just come up with some random situation where everyone gets like a million Marines and you throw them at each other. I think there's like multiple game genres that have sprung out of StarCraft and Warcraft custom maps, including the entire MOBA genre. Possibly tower defense as well. I remember was well.
Yeah, tower defense definitely.
So yeah, that was just an amazing laboratory for game development, and I think I was doing some of that too, even back probably before the Unreal Tournament thing. It came out the year before when I was like 12. So yeah, I was fascinated by it. I loved it. That was awesome.
Did you have like a little? Were you sort of playing Unreal Tournament with friends? Were you making maps and sort of sharing them around or online?
Yes. So I started out. I just made them on my own. I just wanted to make one. It was really the lesson I remember from that time was just learning how to be persistent at something, because I would just hit a technical wall, right? And we didn't have YouTube back then. It was like 1999, 2000. Yeah. So there were very few resources. There were these tutorials that were written out there, which were wonderful by some very generous people who just wrote how to do stuff, but they always had holes in them, and things were always out of date. So I would just find that I didn't know how to do something, and there was just not effective ways to figure that out. Like the whole Discord communities, modding communities, Reddit didn't exist, and certainly I wasn't hooked into that kind of thing. So what I found is that it was actually possible to bash your head against a problem for long enough and figure out how to do something. And the great thing about being 13 or 14 or 15 years old is you got a lot of time to bash your head against walls.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I started doing that. I was just building levels on my own. Later on, I got into modding not that long after. There was a mod called SWAT, which was later renamed to Tactical Ops, which nothing to do with me, but it became an actual commercial game later on. But I contributed to level designs on that very early on. So I got into the modding scene and started trying to contribute to a team there. And I was like the worst one on the team by far, because I was like 13, 14 years old. So I don't think I ever made a map that was particularly popular, although I kept trying, and the people were nice enough not to kick me out of the group for several years. So that was pretty cool. And then after that, I was building forward to making my own mod. Like I transitioned into. I wanted to do more than just levels, so I started making a mod. I called it Elemental Conflict, which was basically sci-fi futuristic Counter-Strike. Not the most original idea, although I do think it is viable, and certainly there's lots of games, in the intervening 2 decades that have come out along that with that concept. And that is the one where I was forced to learn how to write some code in Unreal Script, which I was terrible at. I could never get net replication to work properly. And I was forced to learn how to animate characters so that they could use the weapons that I wanted, and forced to learn how to model things. So it was just a period where I got to learn all of the sub skills one by one, essentially, just by having enough time to do it just after school, through middle school and high school. I learned how to do textures at a basic level. I learned how to do animation, use Photoshop, and so on and so forth, just to put this thing together. And the mod never really went anywhere. We released, I think one person made a server for like a few weeks, and there was very little play of it. But it was a really pivotal period for me because it meant that I could do all this stuff. I could use Photoshop to make a graphic. I could make an animation. I could make a video. I could, write a bit of dialogue and so on and so forth at a basic level. And so later on, when I wanted to make RimWorld, I was able to do every piece of it without an issue. As long as I kept the requirements of our art and our assets within the limited scope of my capabilities. But it was like 10 years later, it was like 12, 13 years later, I did RimWorld from when I actually started. Yeah.
And so when you were like modding and, actually quick side question, did your time at Irrational ever cross over during SWAT 4?
No, I wasn't. I was there long after. I was there kind of just after they released BioShock. And I worked on the DLC for BioShock. PlayStation version had a DLC, which nobody played. As far as I know. I missed
I played it.
So SWAT 4 was talked about very nicely. If you played the PlayStation DLC for BioShock, thank you very much. You saw my first professional work, and I'm very proud of it.
Hell yeah. Little did I know where Tynan would end up afterwards. There were grand things coming. So tell me, when you're a teenager and you're doing these mods and everything like that, did you have kind of vocational aspirations here, or was it just sort of hobbyist? Were you thinking already about doing a comp sci degree, or what was going to happen in college, or just quitting school and everything and making games?
For the first few years, I literally never even thought of it, Like I never even cared. I just like to do it. Like probably 13 through 15 or 16, it wasn't some issue where I'm like, oh, how do I get my foot in the door or whatever? I mean, people talked like that sometimes, but it was just irrelevant to me because I was so young. And it was also irrelevant because I liked doing it no matter what. And it was later on, I did ultimately go to university for a degree that was mixed computer science and art, with the idea that this would help me in game development. It wasn't actually that useful in the end. I found that the stuff that I learned on my own was way more useful and important, and in a lot of cases higher level than the things that I learned at university. But certainly, like by the end, I wanted to go and become a professional designer by 17, 18 or so. But there was a long period when it was not the goal at all.
Were you making any sort of games or mods during your college years as well? Did that sort of continue along the side too?
Yes. Yeah. During university, I was a bit busy with other stuff, trying to have a social life and such.
Yeah, good.
Moved out of home, went to Montreal, so that was a great city to go to university in. So I was pretty distracted. But while I was there, I learned C++ coding, and I made a few attempts at indie games that never released. And this was like 2004 to 6, right? So there was not really anywhere to release an indie game online at that point, and there was not an infrastructure for it. So it was really just a question of making games because I wanted to make them.
It's strange to say, isn't it? Like, it's there. You can imagine a whole generation of game developers coming up now that it's not even fathomable that there literally wasn't a way to do it. Like, even if you had the game and done it, somehow you made your own engine and everything. There was no possible way to really distribute a game.
It was possible. There were a few. I remember this guy named Steve Pavlina, who has like a lifestyle blog or like a better living blog now, and he has for decades. He made a game called Dweep, I think, or it's about dweeps, where it's just this little puzzle game, and he sold it on his own. And that was
on your website, right?
He made like $100,000 or something off that, or something on that order. But he had to like set up his own website and his own payment infrastructure
Yeah.
to do that in his own way of like, you can download the game, and if we want to update it, well, I guess we're screwed because there's not really a way to do that. Security, no. Regional pricing, probably not.
Yeah.
And yeah, everything was just way more primitive. Nowadays, the infrastructure is all set up there. Steam will accept indie games. I mean, back then it just wasn't a thing. You had to be a AAA in connection with Steam. So that was just a different world. But I was still making the games because I liked doing it, and it just I just loved it, you know.
And did you fold out of college straight into a games job, or were you doing other things around and games came a little bit later?
I graduated and I applied to, I did my last semester on exchange in Hong Kong, actually. And I remember at the end of that, just finishing it up, I went to Thailand for like a couple of weeks. And I applied from a hostel in Thailand to a job at Irrational Games. I think it was the only job I applied to. And they called me up, and I went to Boston like a month after that to meet them. And then they wanted to hire me. So it was straight out of college.
And how long are you in Boston now? How long were you in Boston?
No, I was there for like 4 years. Ultimately didn't love that experience. Yeah, working in a giant studio, certainly there were a lot of lessons there, but it wasn't a place where I felt like I could use all of the energy that I had. I wasn't able to really spread my wings there. So it was fun, but I did leave ultimately. I left Boston and went back to Canada after that.
Okay. So tell me about some of the lessons that you felt you learned at a big studio. You know, like you said, you ultimately couldn't spread your wings, but you mentioned some lessons. Was it working alongside other devs, learning off them, or shipping commercial products, or
organizing large groups of people is very difficult. Politics and information flow are a real challenge. It's possible to cycle on ideas for a long time without making progress. Yeah, a lot of it is sort of scars and things that I don't want to do or don't want to repeat, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Since it was a job where I wasn't particularly happy or successful, it's largely sort of a cautionary tale for me.
Yeah, so many of the places that we work, I think even if, you know, it turns out that we have a great time, or, you know, it's not the right fit for us, or we have an outright terrible time at a place, though you can kind of leave with a bit of an antithesis manifesto for like how you would do things the next time around. You know, I think about the crew that have come through League of Geeks and have gone on and, you know, founded their own studios. And I think about all the things we've done well, but the thing that I really wish for them is how they're going to build the studio, taking the things that we do well and improving upon the things that we institutionally perhaps didn't do well, you know, things that I might not even be aware of, or things that me and my business partners were that we're unable to change for whatever particular reasons.
Yeah.
It's exciting to think about those next evolutions of things, you know, people going through places and being like, didn't like how that was done. You know, I'm going to improve on that. That's how League of Geeks, you know, that's how we looked at things. And I'm sure just, you know, knowing what I know about Ludion, like, you know, it sounds like a response to one of those larger studio experiences.
Yeah, it certainly was. I think a lot of it was just perspective of being somebody at the bottom of a big system, like creative organization, where you're kind of getting pushed around, and like you'll create something and then it'll be cut for some completely different reason, and or direction will change in ways that are hard to interpret or hard to understand. Just being directed at a distance like that, especially in a situation where the studio is struggling to scale. Like they went from like 60 people to like 150 people, I think, while I was there, and that just put strains on the organizational structure overall, and especially the director, who was Ken Levine, who was you know, faced with 3 times more people to direct, which is its own challenge. So I understand that now, having gone from being solo to having like 20 something developers working with me at this point. I think that having the perspective of being at the bottom and being directed really helps me like know sort of what it would feel like to be to have my work or my ideas or my messages I guess treated or handled a certain way. And it's a useful perspective for sure.
It gives you that empathy, right? Like being on the other side of it, as opposed to sort of coming up and just finding yourself in creative lead positions the entire time.
Yeah. And now I'm directing as well. So now I have the empathy for like, okay, why stuff has to get cut, you know, and why things happen that make people unhappy. Right. So it's a two-sided thing. It's definitely been valuable.
So let's talk about after Irrational? Well, so you leave Irrational. Did you have something planned, or did you just take a leap of faith? What was next?
I left at the start of 2012, and I basically had enough money saved up, and I had an idea. And the idea was not for a game; it was for a book. I wanted to write a book, basically about game design. So, based on everything I had observed while I was working there for a long time, I had all sorts of thoughts on how we could create games in different or better ways. And I had spent a lot of time while I was there, largely on the subway and at home, reading and synthesizing ideas from books about psychology or books about screenwriting or books about systemic successes and failures in society and groups. And I was starting to synthesize those into a text. And I wanted to take the savings that I had, which was like $50,000 or something like that. It's just saved up over a few years, and see how far I could go just solo and in creating things. So the first thing I did was I went and I started putting the book together, which took a few months, probably 3 or 4 months, I think.
That's a pretty short amount of time for a book.
Yeah, I know, but like you just grind on it, right?
Yeah, it was just in you, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it came out pretty quick once I really got into it. And this is the only thing I was doing. Like, it was basically a do or die situation. Like, you know, the self-talk is you have to make this work because you don't want to, I mean, the worst things that can happen is that you end up back where you started and just get another industry job. But I really did not want to do that.
Yeah.
Because fundamentally, it did not seem like a path that was attractive to me. You know, working my way up through a bunch of big organizations and dealing with all the issues involved in that, it felt like there was a lot of fundamentally different and better things that, better approaches that were available if someone was willing to reach out and use them. So the book was really important for me because it was my process of crystallizing everything that I had learned into a set of actual theories and methods and mechanisms that I could use. It's very easy to have years of experiences or even notes where you know all these things happen, but it's just sort of an amorphous blob of impressions and memories. It's very different to take that into, structure that into a method that you're going to use going forward. And the process of writing the book helped me get that stuff down on paper, but also in my brains. I think that writing that was the best education that anyone could get in game design, to be honest, to have a whole bunch of experiences and then crystallize in that way.
I totally see what you mean, because about maybe 7 years into my career, 6 or 7 years, I was asked to write a course, like a tertiary course for writing video games, essentially at an arts college, a big university here in Melbourne. And it was writing and teaching a course that was a screenwriting degree. I was writing the module for writing for games and writing that course, and then actually teaching it to the students and having them be like, oh, but why? And then having to stand there and explain, you know, the reasoning behind my methodology, or why I, why the industry was structured this way, or why things were done a certain way.
Right.
It was like the last 7 years of being a game designer, narrative designer, writer. Like, it formulated my process in my mind. It crystallized it, like you said. And the thing that occurred to me is how many creatives have gone 3-4 decades in their craft, but just gone from project to project or job to job and never actually stepped back and had to think about why they're doing something. Like, they know their process implicitly, but can they articulate it, or could they break it down for someone else? And it's a really interesting exercise. And it's funny that as craftspeople and creatives, we don't talk about the value of the process more, I think.
Yeah, I think, you can know your process, but really it's just a backwards looking, know what you did sort of thing. Yeah. It's not like someone has sat down and redesigned that or rethought that. And like when I was writing the book, I got really deep into, why do we play games? Like, what are we even trying to do? Like, the whole thesis of the book is that games are there to generate emotional experiences for people.
Yeah.
And that doesn't just mean fun in some sense. It doesn't even have to be a surface level positive emotion. It can be tension. It can be relief. It can be all these things. And it's a very high frequency emotion. Like, it happens very quickly. The emotion is not just like, oh, I'm sad today, or I'm happy today, or he's crying, or she's laughing. It's like every moment, every second, every fraction of a second, people are feeling different things. There's like a moment of surprise, and then a moment of relief, and then a moment of like sort of quizzical, being puzzled, and then a moment of frustration, and that can all compress into a 4-second period. And I think that sort of getting that idea together really helped me, and then I managed to structure everything else around that, in the sense of, okay, everything else is serving this one purpose at the end of the day. When we talk about game balance, the reason we want it to be balanced is because that creates an experience that creates the emotions that we want in the end. It's not otherwise something like balance or tuning. It's just this free floating concept. It doesn't have any axioms that it rests on to be coherent. So I think putting it all together and being able to follow the chain of reasoning of, why should this character have a spell, the green spell instead of the blue spell? Well, it forced me to learn to explain that all the way down to the first principles and every step there. And it's useful because you find holes for sure doing that. Otherwise, you're just kind of going on heuristics that you think you've used before, or something you heard, or whatever you did last time, or whatever the group wants to do, or whatever people usually do, is sort of the herd following pattern matching approach, which is fine in a lot of areas of life, but really pathological when you're trying to do something innovative.
Yeah. You talk about, this sort of theme of apophenia. I've, read articles, or in your GDC talk, you talk about it quite a bit. And I'm sure we'll talk about, this idea of us being sort of pattern matching creatures a bit on the podcast. But how much did that sort of come to the forefront when you really interrogated our experience interacting with video games for the book?
So apophenia is one mechanism among dozens.
Yeah, many.
It's a very important one in RimWorld. Apophenia, to sum it up, is just the idea that people will see patterns where there aren't necessarily patterns. So if you look at the, if you look at a wall outlet, at least in America, it can look like a face.
Yeah.
It's not a face. It's not trying to be a face. Your brain is just perceiving that automatically. Or staring at clouds, you might see a pattern. So those are visual patterns. But when I talk about apophenia, I mostly mean it in a narrative sense, is in people seeing a sequence of events as having a story arc to them. So you can play chess. I play a game of chess, or even watch two computers play chess against each other. They don't have any emotions. It's literally just an algorithm. You could run the same algorithm again and get the exact same game, but you can tell the story of, the rook was trying to do this, and then the pawn blocked the rook, and he was really pissed off about it. And you can humanize things and interpret them that way. This is a very natural human capacity to generate these sorts of stories and interpret things. That's why if you look back into history, you'll find ancient peoples would tend to interpret natural events in the world around them as being perhaps the will of a deity of some kind. The rain falls because the god is sad, sort of narrative. So it's such a natural human capacity that it happens automatically and effortlessly, and it's a super powerful thing for a game designer, because it means that we don't have to do most of the work of creating a story. You can just create a couple of game mechanics that kind of trigger the apophenia in the player's mind, and then they will tell the story based on the relatively sparse kind of skeleton that the game can provide to them. And that's super powerful. But apophenia, again, going back to the whole book, is just like one mechanism. You can talk about a million other aspects of how to create these, how to create all sorts of different experiences using a designed system, which is a game.
I'm interested as well with the book about, because it came out at an interesting time, and it's become obviously partially, thanks to RimWorld's success and, the discovery that's happened for the book there, but obviously because of the contents and the caliber of the book and itself, it's become, one of the formative texts on video games, video game design these days, and, why we play games and how to create experiences. I mean, in an interactive sense, alongside a theory of fun and the art of game design. But interestingly, when you first wrote it, I mean, you'd worked at Irrational for a few years and, been modding as a kid. Like, how do you go about being the guy that all of a sudden steps out and, says, hey, I've written this book on game design, and find a publisher and someone who's willing to take you seriously and even read it, let alone publish it?
Yeah, I mean, bear in mind, when I wrote the book, I was like 26, right? Which is young in the absolute scale, but I was also 13 years into digital game design, and I had been doing work before that. And those are 13 pretty well stacked years. So it's a young age, but it's also a lot of experiences and reference experiences. And if you go back further than that, I'd played endless amounts of games and really processed a lot of that in my brain. So it seemed fairly straightforward, just taking all the experiences and putting them together and thinking about them and reading a ton. Like I read so many books. I said this before, but essentially reading a huge amount of input about psychology and history and art and film and story was really important. And a lot of the book is taking ideas that exist in other areas and merging them together and reinterpreting them and saying, okay, this also makes sense if we restructure it into this context. As for how I got it published, I just found the biggest relevant book publisher, who were O'Reilly. They published the technical books. And they're the biggest publisher in that space, I believe. And I just sent them the whole text. Usually, like a book, people will do a book proposal and then they write the book after they get approved. But I didn't even know about that. And I didn't even care, because I actually just wanted to write the book, largely just do it on my own to get it out of my head. There's sort of an internal pressure of like, I have an idea, I want to get it down, I want to make progress on this project and feel like I've done something today and accomplished something today. So I had the whole book down, and then I sent it to them, which I think they found a little bit weird, but they kind of shrugged and said, yeah, this is pretty good, we'll do this. So
great.
Yeah.
Did you get some notes?
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I got some notes. We went back and forth. There was definitely discussions on various points and copy editing, but they didn't really go after the content that much.
Oh, okay, cool.
It wasn't just the format. And they seem to be pretty happy with it. So the book was never a big money maker. You know, it's as fine as someone buys it or doesn't want to buy it. Books don't make money unless you're J.K. Rowling, I think. So, but I was really proud of it. It helped me, and you know, it's just slowly sold over the years, and kind of probably, I don't know what I expected, but it's done as well as I'd hoped.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm just going to pause here for a second, Tynan, because I remembered I forgot to ask you one very important question, which is going to help me structure this interview. Do you have a hard cutoff today, or when do you want to wrap the episode? Because I can go as long as you want, and I find
I'm pretty good. I mean, I can tell you once I start getting tired, I will get
the book is How to Generate Experiences, or How to Design Experiences.
A guide to engineering experiences.
Right. And you've spoken about RimWorld being a story generator.
Yes.
How has your thoughts on the book changed? Do you go back and reread it? Do you refer to it for advice from time to time, or does it still feel pretty true to your design principles and philosophy now?
Honestly, I think I could write it better, and I would certainly have a lot of new reference experiences and some new sections to add, especially around the details of the kind of game that RimWorld is. But overall, I'm pretty happy with it still. I don't go back and reread it. I think I generally remember the concepts, and I'm kind of moving forward from it. It was really a foundation for me. So yeah, I'm not going and referring to it that much, although I do use concepts and words from it. Like it defines a bunch of terms and ideas and concepts, so I will use those in a discussion for sure. And it's still valuable, but I'm moving forward from it.
And do you think you could have made RimWorld without going through the process of writing the book?
No, I wouldn't have had it all crystallized in my head, especially the process. I think to make RimWorld, I had to go through a dev process, which was not the most obvious or common thing, and it can feel scary when you're doing it, and it's generally hard to do things like that unless you have a deep belief that they're going to be correct. It's hard to do something contrarian without a full and very well-founded like faith that you're doing it the right way, because you have a very well, strongly reasoned reason to do the thing you're doing, even if no one else is doing it. And I think that's a general principle that's useful, is really to do a lot of stuff effectively, or to do something great in an area like game design, where really innovation and doing something that hasn't been done is the currency that is the key to success. It's never okay to follow it doesn't suffice to follow patterns that other people have laid out for you. The pattern following works great in most areas of life, right? You want to make a hamburger, you just do the way that other people made the hamburger, right? If you're looking for a repeatable result, then that's great. But fundamentally, in video games, there's no such thing as repeatable results, because once a game is made, it already exists, and anyone who wants to play it can just play the original. So the only way to add value to the whole ecosystem of video games is to create something that doesn't exist already. That's never been done before. And the only valuable part of what you're making is the part that hasn't been done before. Either it's better than what was there before, or it's different than what was there before, or some combination of those two things. Mm-hmm. So in that framework, you really have to have a first principles understanding of why you're doing what you're doing that's distinct from others, and it has to be believable enough that you're willing to walk away from what everyone's doing and just do your own thing. The thing that I did, which really the book founded my belief in, was not entirely unique, but was still harrowing at the time, and that is prototyping a bunch of games and throwing them out, essentially. I had the theory that pretty much every systems-oriented game that is successful has a very, very small core of game mechanics at the center of it that work if you strip away almost everything else. Like 99% of the game you can take away, and it'll still be kind of compelling and fun. So as examples, if we're going to take, say, StarCraft or StarCraft 2, there are custom maps of those games where it's just Marines and minerals and 2 building types, like command center and the barracks and supply depot, perhaps. And it's still pretty fun just to fight with just those things and absolutely nothing else. So there's no rock, paper, scissors. There's no barriers on the map, nothing else. It's still pretty fun to do that. I think you can play Civilization with a super simple map with just settlers and warriors, just trying to build outwards from there. So based on that theory, I wanted to create a game where I could the core of it was really strong, which means I should be able to make something that is really compelling with very few resources. It shouldn't need a whole bunch of jazzed up graphics and story and contents, etc., to be compelling. And once you believe that, it becomes more sensible to create something, and then if it's not working after like a month and a half, just toss it out and try something else, rather than trying to make something work. I think generally I don't believe in trying to make something work. If it doesn't work, I'd rather just back out and do something else.
Yeah.
I use that all the time when I'm working on RimWorld. People are very loss averse, I think. So oftentimes the instinct is to make something, like fix things or to figure out how to tweak something or recontextualize your game mechanics so that you can push your vision to the finish line.
It's that sunk cost fallacy, even in a creative sense, right?
Yeah, in some sense. It's also just like when you have a vision for what you want to happen or what you want the game to be, it's easy to imagine that the vision has value, but there's actually no way to know whether the cool image in your head is just completely useless and doesn't actually apply to reality until you try it or until you do some analysis to figure that out. And most of the time, a vision of a game will actually just suck if you try to project it into reality. There's going to be some issue that comes up that you just didn't realize was going to happen, some design problem, some self-contradiction that makes it not as engaging as you thought. A lot of the time, it's like the pacing is poor. A lot of the time, a vision will revolve around like a really cool moment, but the rest of the game that has to exist to support that moment is not very interesting. There's a lot of ways for a vision to suck. And it can be a vision for a whole game or even just a vision for one narrow feature. It's very easy to have an idea for a feature and just to realize that if you implement it this way or to create it and then you realize that it creates some trade-off you didn't realize was happening, it's actually screwing the game up and it shouldn't be there. And yeah, I don't like to try to fix stuff anymore. I think it's easy to want to fix things because you want to hold on to what you've got and you think your vision is cool. And there's also this idea that, hey, I'm this badass game designer. If I'm so skilled, shouldn't I be able to fix things? Like, shouldn't I be able to make things work? Like, shouldn't I be able to do what I want? And the answer is no, you don't get to do what you want. What you really are is a good follower of the map that the universe has laid down for you in terms of what's going to work and what's not going to work. You're good at finding things that'll work, not making things work. So that's the philosophy. And after the book came out, I started making prototypes. I got Unity and I learned C#. I actually didn't know it. I was terrible at programming at the start. So I was learning. Previously, I'd only worked in Unreal Script and a bit of C++. So I was actually learning to program in the months up to really starting RimWorld. I think I did like 6 different games. This started in summer of 2012. And first games were like, I did a wizard school simulator. It was like top down. It looked a little bit like Prison Architect, and the students would like go to class and then go to bed and then like this sort of thing. I didn't like that one because a school is really about avoiding anything interesting happening. Your job is to prevent fun.
Yeah.
As the school administrator, which is fundamentally just a flawed system. It's very restrictive that way. It's an institution simulator, which totally works, but they often lack the dynamism that I wanted to have. An institution like a school is something that's built, it's designed once, and then it just runs in a repeatable cycle of activity where you're trying to prevent any instability for a century until you close the school. That's how it works in real life. And munging that into like a dynamic, organic system where player is trying to take risks that can blow back and cause like severe outcomes for their play state is a challenge. I wanted more dynamism. I think that the idea of a wizard school simulator is not completely dead, but it's not the game I wanted to make. And I don't think it's a super sparkly idea in terms of game mechanics. I think it has to be held up by a lot of audiovisual stuff, which I didn't have the budget for. Another one I made was a mercenary economics sim. I was playing a lot of this board game called Agricola at the time.
Yeah.
I had the idea of doing this with mercenaries. I had also played Jagged Alliance 2, which is the old like 1998 turn-based tactics game where you'd get your team of mercenaries and they had to fight on this, to liberate this island from this evil dictator. And I found it interesting. I thought you could just do a character-oriented game from the economic side of the mercenary sim. It turned out to just be kind of very repetitive. It didn't spark quickly enough. I was looking for something that would really come alive with very simple game mechanics. So I dropped that one. I did a zombie exploration survival game. I had like an FTL overmap and then encounter maps, and zombies would attack you while you're robbing houses and such. I think Project Zomboid did something similar along those lines over the succeeding years. The funny thing is most of these games that are prototyped kind of came into existence over the 10 years afterwards to varying levels of success, which I thought was interesting. But they are still kind of stuck with a lot of the original limitations that the fundamental concept has. Like an institution sim is still about fighting for stasis, and that's kind of a problem. There's conflict in the design. I think I had a different mercenary game where you'd go point to point and do like little 3-minute combats. And this is actually where something interesting started to happen, where I created this tactics engine where it was real-time pausable. It was grid-based. Your characters could like stand behind the corner of a wall or behind a barricade and like lean around the wall and shoot. And the enemies would try to, they'd calculate where to try to flank you and shoot at you. And in this game, it was just like 3 to 5 minute encounters where you'd be there to assassinate a dude or something like that. It was like the old Syndicate games. I found there was too much content burden, and just fighting through these combats wasn't that interesting, and it wasn't as interesting as I wanted it to be. But the actual movement and tactics engine worked pretty well. And so I didn't throw that part out. I actually kept it for the next game. So it was using the same like game engine as the school game, because it was a top-down grid-based builder game. And then I took that and made a tactics shooting engine inside that. But I threw away the whole school aspect. So now we're working on a game where I'm not just throwing out the entire project anymore. I'm like keeping chunks of it, while also replacing other large sections of it. So I keep the tactics engine, get rid of the mission structure, keep the like building tile engine, but get rid of the school concept or that management sort of structure. And I think this is also a powerful idea that people miss. People tend to think of a project as this unitary object that has to be kept or thrown away all as a single thing. And that's kind of embedded in even how we choose game projects. People pitch their project to a publisher, and the publisher will say yes or no, but there's never, or much less often, is there an idea of, hey, this game kind of sucks, but this third of it, as defined by this set of game mechanics, actually does kind of work. Like the jumping is cool, but the city sucks, the story sucks, and it shouldn't be multiplayer. So let's just take the jumping and put that and like transplant that out and build another structure around that supports it better, or emphasizes that aspect. I think that's goes to the philosophy of not trying to make things work, but discovering things that'll work, being a good explorer instead of a master creator who can do whatever you want. You can't do what you want. You have to find what works and follow it. So the next game was a starship architect game.
All right, we're getting closer.
Architect. You could build your starship with the block building tools and move your characters around inside, and they could go in and out, and then could like fly from planet to planet. And you'd have like a little cargo bay that you built, and you could like pick up cargo and then sell it somewhere for more money. Honestly, moving the characters in and out of the ship was really annoying, just because they would have to go through the airlock.
Yeah,
and so they would go to repair something on the outside of the ship, and then they'd go through the slow airlock procedure. And then they'd go and repair like one block, and then they'd go through the slow airlock procedure to go back in. And it was just like really annoying to deal with that. They were dithering is the term for this. And I just kind of didn't want to deal with it. Also, just having the empty blackness of space around the ship was uninteresting. Building the ship was pretty cool. Character movement was cool. Those aspects worked. So RimWorld was born when I took the Starship Architect game and just put it on the ground. And I'm like, let's just render a big field of soil under this ship. It's no longer a ship. It's a colony. The characters can walk around outside. Oh, we can put resources outside. Now there's stuff for them to interact with. Oh, now people can just walk up to you like from the outside of the map and attack you or trade with you. There's so much more dynamism. You can build different buildings separately from each other. And we can make it more about the characters instead of about this ship, which is under all these tight design restrictions. And that was the game that took the combat engine from the Mercenary game and the tile-based like wall and building structure from the Wizard game and the building, like the character can build walls system from the Starship Architect game, and put those three pieces together into a new setting. And finally, it all started sparking. I had my old friend of mine over to test the game. I remember this is in like February of 2013. So I was 7 months into doing all these prototypes.
So 7 months you spent on all of these prototypes.
Yeah,
so like you're spending like a month and a half on each one or something.
Yeah, I started in like June 2012.
Okay.
So 7 months in, and I had my buddy over. It was like 10 p.m. when he started. I was just like, hey, play this game for me and let me know what you think. And this is the pre-RimWorld game, right? So it was called Eclipse Colony at the time. There were no character graphics. It was just yellow dots for characters. The walls are just sort of these gray line things. It was all very abstracted, but still readable, as in you could interpret what was going on if you wanted to.
Yeah.
And it was a very heartening session because he came with his girlfriend, and I was with the girl I was dating at the time, and like he wouldn't stop playing. Like we were trying to talk to him and stuff, and he was just zoned right in. And it was the best feedback ever. And obviously he gave me some thoughts on it, but he played for like 2 hours. We were falling asleep. It was 12:30. I was getting really late. Like, you know, his girlfriend was like falling asleep on my bed because I lived in this little, like, you know, I had a room with roommates, right? So we were just in there playing the game. And that is when I decided, okay, this is the part that's going to work. It's got all these different pieces from different games that independently worked, and now we've put them together. And this is what I want to commit to. Because it had the spark. Like, it wasn't that complicated of a game, fundamentally. Yeah. I don't even know if it had combat at that point. I think it did, but it was very, very basic. But just being able to have characters there and just build things and have some idea of building and having progress forward while you're building and like mining a thing that's sitting there on the map. Very, very straightforward play cycle, but it worked. And at that point, it was really about deciding what the philosophy of the game would be, and I settled on, you know, narrative generation, character-oriented story generation, and so on and so forth. I looked at a lot of Dwarf Fortress and worked through that summer and came out with the Kickstarter, which was in September, October that year.
Let's talk a little bit about the story generation, because like you said, there's a couple of things that I want to interrogate there, right? So the first one is deciding to find the philosophy of the game, which is a really interesting way to put it. Right. Someone might say the design pillars, right? Or the vision for the game or something. But you've got this prototype that, as you were talking about before, has a really small core system, which you can expand upon. You've got that tight loop that's working really well, and you're looking for a philosophy. So I'm keen to just hear, you know, a lot of people would just continue making the game, or, you know, like whatever that may mean for them. But it sounds like you actually stopped and were like, okay, what is this? If I'm going to make it bigger, if I'm going to actually make it, like, what is this thing as, you know, as a piece of art, or as a philosophical piece? Why do you think you sort of you had that moment, or what brought that on?
Yeah, I don't tend to think of it in terms of, just to start off, like art or philosophy. I think there's a philosophy of what the game is about, but to me, that's a philosophy of how it should work on the player to create those emotions that we want.
Yeah.
It's not a highfalutin thing of like, oh, we're trying to express this abstract idea about the universe. It's really just trying to teach you, to put the player's brain through those paces and through that experience that they'll find compelling one way or the other. So it's purely a practical mechanism that I'm thinking of. Now that mechanism is fascinating. And in order to do that effectively, you have to know the philosophy of what you're trying to do. And the one that I chose was make human stories. I had looked at a lot of the stories that people wrote about Dwarf Fortress, which is that very well-known game without graphics, where it has, this is a game that I think the developer started in like 2005 or something like that, and he's still working on it. Tarn, he's a great guy. And it doesn't have graphics, it just has characters where you don't see the characters as in like text characters. So a goblin is just a letter G, and it looks like something from like 1985.
It's all ASCII art, right? Yeah.
It's all ASCII art. There's literally no images in this game. There wasn't even mouse support until recently. But it is an incredibly sophisticated simulation, grid-based simulation of a dwarven fort, right? So every dwarf's toe armor and like the state of the skin on their left pinky finger is modeled. Like the cats can get drunk because they licked the floor of they licked their paws after walking through a tavern and there was beer on the tavern floor, right? So the cat.
I'm sure you won't be surprised when I tell you that we had them on the podcast and we spoke to Tynan and Zach for 4 hours.
Yeah, that makes sense. They have a lot to say.
Yeah. But it's the stories that come out of it, right?
Yeah, that was a game that was like very well known at the time, but it was also a game that people they weren't even selling; they were just taking donations, which they still do. They still give the game away, and also people had a lot of trouble playing, but there were these amazing stories that people would write online about what had happened to them in Dwarf Fortress. I think the original famous one was Boat Murdered. And the level of interpretation and the hilarity and drama that was in these stories, I just found fascinating. And I found the stories almost more entertaining than the game. I think I only played Dwarf Fortress for like 10 hours. But the stories, I found that really inspirational. And the basic idea that I developed for RimWorld was, what if we could make a game that was going to generate stories like that, but was a lot more accessible and a lot easier to play, and would go straight to what makes those stories great, as opposed to doing what I think Tarn has said his goal is with Dwarf Fortress, which is build a simulation of this whole world, basically. Like a large-scale simulation of a fictional generated fantasy universe. I wasn't so interested in that. I didn't want to go large scale. I wanted to narrow straight down. I think I noticed the fact that when people wrote those stories, like Boat Murdered, they tended to focus a lot more on just a few dwarves. In the late game on Dwarf Fortress, you can get up to 200 dwarves. But when you start out, you only have 7. And the stories tended to be just about 7 or 10 or 12 dwarves. And if you look at any like prestige TV show, even with a lot of characters, your Walking Dead or Sopranos, there's still only 15 to 20 characters generally. You don't have hundreds of characters. In games, designers tend to put in large numbers of characters in a strategy game just so you have more pieces to move around, or because you want progression, like you want to give the player more power over time because that's entertaining. But being super restrained with the character count became a core philosophical idea in RimWorld, just on the observation that if the game's fundamental goal is to make human stories, you can only do that up to a certain number of characters. And that is like a really important restriction on everything else that happens in the game. And really guided the design mechanically. So based on everything that I saw with Dwarf Fortress and the way RimWorld was developing, I came up with the philosophy that, yes, it should be a human story generator. And then once that's established, a lot of stuff follows from that. And a lot of it is inherently a little bit contrarian against a lot of typical game design patterns that you see in your games like Civilization or StarCraft, strategy management games, because usually they want to scale up and up and up and get bigger and bigger and bigger. That's always the impulse. Players want it. Players always want to scale up power. And a great idea in a video game design process is often just to give players what they want. But in this case, it leads you to somewhere that's really cool. Civilization is awesome. StarCraft is awesome. But it leads you away from somewhere else, which is also cool, which is being small, or at least small in the number of characters that you have.
Having like personal, intimate story arcs that are focused on
really
relationships. Yeah.
Knowing each character and caring about them because you've been with them for a while and you remember when this character, when Joey met Sally, and then you remember when they got married, and then you remember when Sally lost her leg, and then you remember when you went on the quest to get the bionic leg to replace Sally's leg, and then how happy she was. And you created this Apophenia story in your head about how Joey, came over the horizon with the leg in hand, all bloodied and battered after his quest to give the leg to Sally, right? And that's really cool. And then you tell your friends that, and then they want to buy the game, or you say it on stream because you're a streamer, and the game is viral that way. So, hitting the philosophy of story generation automatically differentiated RimWorld and always has, just because usually games are very mechanical. They're very focused on replicating game mechanic over and over. You build more troops, bigger factory, scaling up, scaling harder. That is intrinsically anti-story in a lot of ways because it scales things beyond what the characters are capable of, or what the characters are capable of interacting with. And that's a real challenge.
So when you hit that sort of discovery, that realization, so you're playing Dwarf Fortress, you're thinking about these things, and where the game's sort of heading, and what those philosophical guidelines or the pillars are going to be, the vision for the game, and you land on story generation. I imagine it's this moment where you're like, oh, okay, as similar to moments like we all have, when you pass a big milestone in your cognition about something that you're creating, and then things start to fall into place. You get this huge amount of forward momentum. But interestingly, when it comes to story generation, and your GDC talk goes into a lot of this, which is, it's contrarian to game design. And you've just written this book called Designing Games, talking about generating and engineering experiences. And now you've chosen a principle that is incredibly contrarian to the way that people are making games. That forward momentum is almost taking you in a direction of completely uncharted territory, away from, these patterns of process and design and development that we've had for, a decade or more. Did you find that forward momentum sort of just helped you tear through that uncharted territory and very exciting things were happening? You've spoken about the importance of having, a really strong faith in where you're heading, and if it's creating a story generator, how did you build that faith? And tell me the steps after you actually decided that was it, that you put something down in a meaningful way that made you go, yeah, okay, this is not only is it a good idea and I can see a path for it where we're going to differentiate, but I can actually do it and I can achieve it in these ways. It's possible.
I think that writing the book was essential, going back to that, because it forced me to develop a more general and fundamental theory of why people are playing these games. On the surface, you're playing a game because you want to win, right? Or because you want to socialize, or because you like to build things. And it's easy to say, well, there's games where you win, and then there's games where you kill, and games where you socialize, and games where you build things. And I'm going to make a game where you win because there's all these other games. And I'm going to, okay, how does that work? Okay, we're going to have players with different abilities, but those have to be balanced against each other. So we're going to do that. And it's easy to be kind of stuck in a pattern of sort of a narrow theory that encapsulates part of why people play games, or one reason why people might want to play games, while missing the fundamental substructural reason that's common to all these experiences. The fundamental reason is, very simplistically, just people like to feel things. People like to feel certain experiences. And I think once that's understood, it allows one to understand and believe that it's possible to want to feel things and feel experiences that aren't well represented in games in the patterns that they exist so far. You don't have to scale up constantly. in the way that games always do. You don't have to always give players a bigger gun or larger numbers all the time, although RimWorld does in some ways, but we're try to be restrained with it. It's once you have a more fundamental theory of what you're doing, it opens up whole new practical applications, whole new pathways to satisfy that theory, to satisfy that goal that are not explored yet, just because either nobody noticed them for whatever reason. There's a lot of arbitrary ordering to when different game genres came into existence, or because they're a little bit contrarian to what comes naturally to the people in the industry. I think a lot of the difficulty, the obsession that typical games have with hard mechanics and systems and essentially inhuman numerical interactions is related to the fact that the people who are making them are huge nerds who love computers and systems.
Yeah, they're looking at numbers, right?
Yeah, and they're programmers, right? Like, it's like if the only people who could make a movie are the people who can build a camera, you might get a lot of movies about people who are worrying about machinery and cameras and planes and the stuff that those makers are interested in. In indie games, especially, the only people who can make games are the ones who can program. Especially in the past 10 years ago and further back than that. So that creates a tremendous bias in the kinds of things that get explored. But going back to the fundamental idea, yeah, like there's whole game genres that have not been discovered yet. And we regularly discover new ones, like entire mechanisms of entertainment that nobody ever thought of before. Like anyone could have made Escape from Tarkov or PUBG, a decade earlier than they did.
Yeah.
Someone could have built RimWorld back in the 90s. Someone could have built Minecraft, 10 years earlier. It's just we didn't realize that it was going to work that way because we hadn't done that experiment and realized, when you just let players like build blocks together in a world, it creates this incredibly compelling experience of mixed creativity and survival without very much work on the part of the game developer that players find just absolutely fascinating. It's discovery of those mechanisms. So RimWorld is built on a set of mechanisms, specifically these story generation, character generation mechanisms, which I thought were not well explored, but which I observed were true. Like they actually worked and existed. You can sort of see hints of them in a lot of predecessor games and other games already. So if you think about XCOM, which I think the original came out in like 1993, it's the game where you have a squad and you go around fighting aliens and tactical battles one after the other. People name their squad members. There's not really other content to the squad members, but they become very attached to their squad members. Sometimes they name them after themselves or their friends, or they name them in like a husband and wife combo. They're creating incredible stories about these characters that have gone through all these battles and survived. And it's super tragic when you lose someone who you care about. And I noticed that worked. It worked on me because I played XCOM as well. And it revealed that it's like a hint that like there's a little thread, like there's something that's working there, even though we're not trying to make it work. It's like we stumbled upon something, like a mechanism, some sort of psychological mechanism there is functioning. And to me, that kind of thread, that like unpulled thread, is a very interesting thing to watch for, and is a very powerful way of finding opportunities to go somewhere where other people haven't explored yet, other designers haven't explored. Because again, like we're not good at making things. We're just good at finding things. And so if you can notice those sort of signals that there's something there, and then assemble that together with other signals that there was something there in terms of story generation. Like, people love movies. People love all sorts of stories. You can read about screenwriting and how story structure works. Robert McKee he has a book called Story, which is very good about this, which I always recommend. And realize that, those mechanisms are totally projectable into a game mechanical system. Like he talked about, creating a story where, okay, the protagonist tries to do something and then the world pushes back much farther, much harder than expected. And that's like a fundamental element of screenwriting for him, is, that tension between protagonist action, the world pushes back super hard, and then it creates this kind of elastic tension where now it's a story. Now it's interesting. And that's what makes it interesting, as opposed to everyday occurrences that are predictable. Yeah, you can take that idea and like put that into a video game. Like it's totally accessible to you. Yeah. And then noticing how people played Dwarf Fortress and wrote stories about it. So it was like I sort of felt like there was this, and still is, honestly, this whole arena of game design and specifically game experiences around generated stories, that whole area, which is not really well explored. Like there's sort of people accidentally falling into it here and there and getting remarkable benefits out of it, like XCOM, and various other games. But I think that writing the book created and really embedded that fundamental theory of emotional triggering into me at the time, and that's what led me see all that and realize, it would be a really good bet to try to make something in that direction. I think this is working. I think we're going to push that way. We're going to see what we find there. If it doesn't work out, we'll make more of a traditional strategy type game. Yeah, that's really where the belief in it came from and the philosophy. And there has been like essentially constant pushback on that in one way or another for 10 years.
Do you mean pushback externally or pushback like mechanically from the game or yourself?
Just in general, just in this, not in the sense of like aggression, but people consistently asking for things that would move away from that and move more towards a traditional bigger numbers, bigger guns, more troops sort of hard strategy game. Yeah. Now, RimWorld has a lot of those hard strategy elements to it. You do build bigger, you do get better guns and so on and so forth. It has the progression, but that's something that I sort of allow into the game as necessary. It's not something I energetically push into the game, because what I'm always pushing in is the part that's hard to get in. It's the part that's difficult to do, which is the narrative generation with characters. And the strategy game, the hard strategy game, is sort of a scaffolding around that. But usually the design requests and the suggestions, so many suggestions, generally revolve around sort of turning the game into StarCraft mixed with Civilization on some level. Because it's very easy to understand that, and because the huge weight of games that existed for the last 25, 30, 40 years is largely in that direction. Aside from like your Dungeons and Dragons, it's largely hard strategy, building more, stronger, smarter.
It's that player
victory to win always.
Right? Player determinism factor, like a skill test assumption or some sort of like cognitive test that if I'm the player, if my skill is high enough or if my cognitive planning is high enough and then I manage to execute that cognitive plan, I should be rewarded. And there shouldn't be pushback, right? Whereas a story generator, as you're saying, like in the example of Robert McKee, almost has like a chutes and ladders kind of aspect to it, right? Like a snakes and ladders aspect.
And it cuts so hard against the traditional mechanical game design patterns. Like you use the word skill test, which is the correct word to describe what I think a lot of games are, including your Counter-Strike or your Civilization or StarCraft. The fundamental mechanism of these skill testing games is we're going to put you under some stress, which is going to be engaging to play through. And then if you succeed and you pass the test, you're going to get the reward, and that's going to be a feeling of triumph. So essentially, they're just triumph simulators. And then if you don't succeed, you're going to have this feeling of frustration, but that's motivation as well. Yep. So it's just this balance between effort and triumph. And triumph is a great emotion, right? It totally works well, but it's so absurdly dominant in game design that people very commonly get confused into thinking that this is all that games are, right? They think that a game is something where you have players who are competing with each other in a rule set. And I've seen these like academic definitions of a game that revolve around this idea, where essentially they just assume every game is a skill test, just because chess is, and because tennis is, and because StarCraft is, and Counter-Strike is. But it's not true at all. A game is a system that can generate any kind of experience. And obviously that's become more and more apparent over the last 15 years or 20 years with games like The Sims or SimCity. Like those are some of the early games that stepped out of that space and sort of get ignored in a lot of these theoretical discussions. So when you're making a game that's not a skill test and not just a building game either, like your SimCity or The Sims, it creates a lot of very specific new design challenges. In a skill test, there's always the fundamental expectation that if the player does well, they should be rewarded. There's this contract that the game kind of covertly gives the player that says, try hard and you'll get what you deserve. In a building game, it's It's very similar, actually. It's not a skill test to play SimCity so much, but it is a game. It's more of a toy where it doesn't really push against you. You kind of get what you do in a building game.
Yeah.
But in a story generator, neither one of these applies. It has to be the case that bad things can happen, even if the player does well, which is really kind of a bit of a mind fuck and a very different idea, and creates a lot of tension with within the game design and against the expectations that players have about how games should work in general.
I'm really keen to talk about the expectations that players have because, excuse me, coming from Armello, we came up against this a bunch, right? To the point where we had to put things in game. We created like a 101 basics of the game to explain to people that like this isn't a deterministic strategy game. There's a lot of RNG and your goal. It's because we were trying as well to create we knew that the experiences that we had from board games like Talisman or, these other like adventure style tabletop role-playing games were the stories that you would craft together, right? So we wanted to create we looked at the hero's journey, the monomyth, and we were like, how can you create the hero's journey within a digital multiplayer like board game, essentially? And we tried to create a game that would emulate that. And every time that you played from the very start of Armello, it was like, how do you bring a board game to life? And how do we create something that players have a different story of treachery and backstabbing and heroics every time they walk away from it? But we came up against this thing time and time again when people would just say the game has too much RNG, blah, 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 to where we would plaster it everywhere on Steam, create a video, put it in-game. And something that's interesting about RimWorld is that you've managed to, obviously the game is reviewed incredibly well, has sold millions of units. You've managed to somehow, even though there is this contention and you're pushing against this huge entropic factor, of like decades of game conventions and skill tests being the presumption here for players when they enter an interactive experience.
Right.
What did you do that successfully, and I imagine you still have your vocal minority that, leave a bad review and walk away or that just bounce off the game, but what did you do and what advice would you give to other game developers that are pushing into a new area or pushing up against really strong embedded conventions to help set player expectations for their game? How are you successful with that with RimWorld? Because I know it says it when you first get in and everything, and it's on the game on the Steam page. But what do you think the things that worked were?
Yeah, I mean, we did some of the same stuff you did, I'm sure. I mean, starting from the marketing, right? It's marketed as a story generator. It's the first line in the Kickstarter, even back in 2013, and it's the core idea in all of our marketing. That's one prompt that makes a tiny difference, but it adds up. On the game's main page, it says, it's a story generator. When there's also a lot of different ways to play RimWorld. So I would say a lot of this is the fact that we don't force people to, accept losses if they really want to try to configure the game a different way. People can set a million different difficulty and challenge settings to very high and very low levels in RimWorld. It's always been a challenge in trying to label those things accurately and present them in a way that will guide players to the correct decision. There are still lots and lots of complaints in various places online. People saying, I set the game to like 500% losing is fun difficulty. And why are there so many enemies? Like, this sucks, basically. So that's a challenge. How to help people accept it? I think largely it's been, honestly, the game gives you the choice of having the experience I just described and the choice of not. For the players who are willing to, you're going to go in a difficulty setting that's appropriate for you. You're going to choose the right storyteller. At the start of the game, it says you can choose your storyteller, who doesn't determine the difficulty, but the storyteller determines kind of the pacing of how events happen and how random things are. So the main choice is between Cassandra Classic, who has sort of a regular pacing, just like a couple bad things and then some open time, then a couple bad things, then some open time. That's more of a balanced, skill testy type experience. Yep. Or Randy Random, who literally just does random events at all times. So you can get like 4 raids within 30 seconds. And like you'll have the mechanoids attacking from here and the pirates from here and the tribals from here. And they'll start fighting each other and just like crazy stuff goes on. It can be beneficial. It can be terrible. It can be very unbalanced. But it's also very dynamic and very storyful a lot of the time, which makes it acceptable. So first thing is priming and prompting and setting expectations like verbally in marketing and in text. So I think second thing is give people the choice not to do it that way. There are ways to set up RimWorld which are fairly obvious, which are more predictable, or less aggressive, or peaceful mode where you're not going to get killed. It's just a creative game, much more like SimCity, for example. And I think a third main mechanism has been making those losses palatable. There's ways to create drama and loss and failure that don't feel final or unrecoverable. I wrote about this in the book. It's this idea called elastic failure that I came up with. Basically the notion that, in a skill test game, it's fine to just fall below a certain, like your health hits 0 and you just die, right? And like you're tested over, like you suck so badly that we're not even going to keep going. Essentially, the test is over. You already failed, so go away. It's kind of what the game is saying there. But why does it have to, right? Like your health can hit 0, and then your guy can kind of crawl away from the fight and do something else, or you could wake up in a hospital, or you could inhabit some other character who can be sent in to rescue the first guy, and so on and so forth, right? There's lots of ways to continue the story. If you just drop the assumption that it's a test that you can fail, the story can just keep going. Like you look at a movie, right? Think of it like a movie story. Psycho, the Alfred Hitchcock movie. The main character dies like a third of the way into the movie, like she's dead. And then like another guy just shows up and now the movie's about him. So you can break the assumptions of like, that the skill test framework creates. And I think a lot of that goes into this. So for RimWorld, it's stuff like elastic failure is where players losing, makes a mistake, terrible things happen, bad luck, and you lose a bunch, but you're not actually dead, and you can kind of be pulled back into a neutral state again. And it's the sense that there's an elastic pulling you forward. Kind of like those racing games where the AI cars slow down when you're sucking a little bit, but it's a lot less obvious when it's a complex story generator like RimWorld. So RimWorld, like if all your characters are down, the Man in Black shows up, and that's just the character who just joins your colony like that for free. He's got a black hat and a black duster and a revolver. And a lot of the time, like, if your last guy got downed by an angry rabbit or something like that, the Man in Black can show up, bring them all back to bed, kind of nurse them back to health, and life goes on. And characters, like, we just turned a annoying failure into an awesome story. Yeah. Because it didn't end. All your characters are down. They can't recover on their own. The game just like gives you another guy to help you out. And players always accept this. They're never like, oh, screw this. They don't, they don't. The Man in Black was such a huge, like probably one of my favorite pieces of the design, to be honest, because it was so easy to do and added so much value to the game.
Was that a post-release edition?
Yeah, that was, no, it was somewhere in the alphas.
Yeah,
okay, it was like Alpha 10 or Alpha 12 or something like that. I remember just watching a streamer die. It was FG Squared, I think, and like all her 3 colonists were bleeding out, and I was just like, it would have been so much better right now if some other person just joined her and like, let's just
divine intervention. Someone appeared, yeah,
because they weren't like wiped. There weren't like mechanoids murdering them. And there's other things, like when your colonists get shot, they fall down, but the enemies don't kill them. They just lay there, and if you can rescue them within a day or so before they bleed out or starve to death or something, then you can just get them back. So even if you lose a battle, you haven't necessarily lost anything permanently. Or even if the pirates capture them, now they're in the world somewhere, and pretty soon you're going to get a quest to go and rescue them. Yeah. So whatever you lose, you can get back, you can recover typically. And that makes the story better, as opposed to saying, okay, game's over, done. Like, you suck so much, we're not even playing anymore, right? The game is going to take the ball and go home because you failed so hard. The game, RimWorld just tends to not do that. Now we're at the point where even if your colony wipes, everybody dies, it's just burned out husk in the ground and everyone's been burned to a crisp. You can just like press a button and have like new wanderers arrive. And now you have some new people in this colony, and they can like build up from the ruins, and you can kind of continue the story. And now it's a story of a place instead of a story of people, because those people all died. But it's also possible those corpses are still there. And then eventually you can find a resurrector serum and get one of them back. Or someone was captured, and then you can eventually rescue them and continue the story with the characters that matter to you. So there's a ton of elastic failure. I would say that's the third element that makes this work, and a major part of it. Story generation with hard game ending failure, very frustrating because it feels arbitrary.
Yes.
it's like if Luke's parents die and then he goes on to like, that's tragedy, that's a failure, but then he can come back and gain strength and fight the Empire and win, and that is his recovery. If Luke's parents and Luke and everyone just dies and the movie's over, that's not very interesting. So it's a choice of like between those two pathways, and the game can have a million. You just look for opportunities of this, a million different mechanisms and places to say, how can we do a continuation? As opposed to just ending the game.
Yeah, there's no trilogy in Luke falling into alcoholism on the moisture farm, is there? Right?
Oh, that'd be fine, right? But then he could get better, or maybe like he has a son, or like some kid shows up and like nurses him back. I mean, he kind of fell into alcoholism sort of in episode 7. Not that
I love it. It's like the most like RimWorld creator answer as well. I'm like, oh well, there's no story there. You're like, no, there is. Then this could happen. Then that could happen.
But I mean, it's like Luke getting burned to a crisp, and like everyone just dying. The story can still continue, but it's just about different people, and that just becomes sort of this thematic thing. And it's thematic continuation, which isn't usually strong enough to carry a player through. General players will stop. The thing that I'm always trying to stop RimWorld players from doing is just like ending the game and save scumming and reloading the moment something goes wrong, right? I really encourage people to play in commitment mode, which is Iron Man mode, where you can't save the game until you quit, basically. So it's you play through every play situation, but I understand it's also stressful and so on and so forth. I'm very accepting of the idea that people want to play the game in different ways. Probably most of them don't play the way that I would, as a purist, want them to play, treating the game as a deep, hardcore story generator. I don't think most people are doing that, but that is the core identity of the game. And I think all the pressure that I put on the design to try to be that adds a lot of flavor and color and variation, even when you're playing it in a mode where that's not the primary goal.
Yeah. Tynan, I'm just going to stop here for a second because we got about 10 or 15 until 7:30 on your end. So we can either push for another half an hour up until 8, or I can start to wrap things up now. How are you feeling?
I can go further if you want.
Okay. Look, cool. I'm just going to push through to 8, and if the conversation's still flowing, we'll keep going a little bit longer. And in this chat, you just type "wrap it up," and I'll give us a soft. I'll do a soft exit, 5 to 10 minutes afterwards or something.
Yeah, I feel good. I feel fine.
Cool.
A half hour should be fine.
All right. Well, look, we've spoken a lot about getting up to RimWorld and the reasoning behind it and stuff. And you have already spoken a bit, like you have this fantastic GDC talk, RimWorld, Contrarian, Ridiculous, and Impossible Game Design Methods, which is currently free to watch on YouTube. And you talk a lot about, getting the game to market and the philosophies behind it, like we've spoken about, and you go into more detail there about examples and instances. So we won't dive too much into that. And then, of course, the book that we were talking about before, which we never mentioned the name, is called Designing Games. It's available at tynansylvester.com/book. I'll give you the plug there. So if anyone's interested in diving into that, you can go and check out the book there. I want to actually jump forward now because, as we mentioned, you've got a decade now of post-release updates. And obviously, as you mentioned before, there are a bunch of alphas in there. So first of all, tell me when the V1.0 release was, and let's talk about, I think, a great launching off pad for this conversation about what sort of came after that and this process of working with a community and helping you reach this goal of a story generator. I'm interested as well in, how you've scaled from having a small team and the Ludian method that you've spoken about a bit, especially in your GDC talk, right? So when did you hit V1.0, and what was the thing that what was your goal for V1.0? Or what was the light at the end of the tunnel that showed you that you were about to approach it, and how did you come towards closing that out?
So just to run through the whole timeline, the first Kickstarter version was something like a year in development, depending on how you count the start. After that was 2013. We didn't put it on Steam for 3 years until 2016. Not even in early access, because I did not think it was ready for that large Steam audience. I didn't want the negative reviews. I didn't want the community drama. We were changing it so aggressively that I thought that, the people who are just buying it on our website, which is a relatively small number, was more than enough to sustain us economically, and more importantly, to give us the feedback that we needed.
And you say us, how many of you were there at the time? Just 2 of you?
So when I started out, I was solo. Alistair Lindsay did, audio for the trailer. He did the music, although I did all the sound effects in the game, just for like 3 sounds that I found in the game. And this is a period when I was Rapunzel helped me with some of the character art, but generally I did almost all the art as well.
Yep.
This is a period when I was able to use all those random skills that I learned when I was a teenager to make, I know how to make a ground texture or a little character art or something like that, right? Like I can spend literally 5 minutes drawing a blue buffalo or something like that.
Yeah.
Now it's a new animal in the game, and now there's plushies of it, 10 years later, which seems kind of ridiculous to me. But the point was just to do what's necessary and get it done, to fill the need and move forward, as opposed to noodling on random pieces of the game.
Yeah.
And it's 3 years off Steam, which is a pretty long time. And we could have put it on Steam at any point there, but we were updating it very aggressively and breaking save games to some degree and breaking mods, certainly to a larger degree. And the game wasn't quite tight enough. So I thought that if we put it out on Steam, it would come out passively weak and then saddle us with reviews for a long time.
Yeah.
That we didn't want to have. Unfortunately, one of the quirks of Steam is that every review you get lasts forever.
Forever, yeah.
And still applies, even though the RimWorld today is nothing like what it was, in 2016 when it hit Steam, but those reviews still apply.
Yeah.
I think that turned out to be a good idea. When it came out, it had like 97 in review score, 95, which was certainly solid. And then over a couple of years after that, it went up to 98 as I basically just read the reviews and fixed the stuff they complained about. There was some fraction of them that was like, hey, it doesn't have a tutorial. This is confusing. It sucks. So I'm like, okay.
Game design, rocket science. You heard it.
Put it in the tutorial and now those went away and now it's at 96.5, right? And then some people complained about this or that and we just fixed that. That was cool. So 2016 came out on Steam Early Access. That was kind of the big original release. And then 2018, it hit version 1.0 and we released it as final. And 2018 was, about 6 years after I started development. It was the time right there. And I thought that was enough. What I said at the time, and I still say is, yes, it doesn't mean that there's literally nothing that we could add to it or nothing that could possibly be improved, but it is, it really satisfies the goal that it has. It's enough. Certainly it's worth the money in terms of the time enjoyment people were getting out of it. And it's time to take that as a foundation and move forward. The team was growing over this time. So I was solo at the start. Early 2014, I hired this 20-year-old Polish kid who was this kind of computer prodigy. And he still works with me. He's my tech director now, Peter. So that's great. And, over the years after that, I hired a few more people, but mostly it was about 5 people back then in that period. Something like 4, 6, 7, maybe here and there. And that was very straightforward to run, actually. It wasn't too hard. It was basically me being able to make the game, but also people to help run pieces of it. There weren't management layers or that kind of corporate structure yet, which was a great period of time. So 2018, we hit 1.0. And then since then, we've been doing the expansion pack. So that's been something like one every 14 months. We put out an expansion. And then each expansion comes with a big update to the core game. Because one of the challenges of updating this game is that when we update, we break the mods. And at this point, RimWorld has 10,000 mods on the Steam store. It's quite a bit and quite a bit of drama to do that. So it's very disruptive to the community. Modders don't want to be constantly updating. Otherwise, I would put out updates every month. So we put out an expansion, we synchronize it with the main game update. We make sure the base game update has a bunch of juicy stuff in it to make sure people don't get too pissed off at the fact that we broke all their mods. It's kind of a give and take there, right? It's let us break all your mods and we'll give you all these features that you've been asking for.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
And trying to just keep everybody happy and keep the community positive, which it remains. So I'm happy with that.
Let's talk about keeping everybody happy, especially, and let's talk about that early access period up until v1.0, because you've had and we did a backer beta as well, after Kickstarter. We didn't sell the game on our own website, but we had a period for Armello where we had backers in there, and like you, we were just pumping out updates. I think every fortnight, and really aggressively progressing the game at that point. And the interesting thing was the relationship with those players to the relationship with our Steam community wasn't sort of better or worse, but it was very different. As you can imagine, the different levels of investment and the different, the levels of visibility and sort of scale of players as well. And I know that you've spoken before in your GDC talk about, the big list, the spreadsheet that you have of like prioritizing things to do in the game.
Google Doc, actually, but yeah.
What was that? Sorry?
It's a Google Doc.
Google Doc. Yes, sorry, Google Doc. So why don't you sort of like fill our listeners in a little bit about that, about your process of adding things to the game? Because, again, with a story generator, you're approaching it from a completely different standpoint. You've obviously no doubt got some sort of balancing concerns and things like that, but the meta for you can be pushing the game. You add something, then all of a sudden all the experiences tend to push towards a Greek tragedy as opposed to something else. So You've got your own visions for the game and closing it out, but then you've got this community that are there that, like you said, there are reviews, you've spoken about that, but no doubt the forums were just stacked with, idea after idea, like they could come out of nowhere and from every angle with RimWorld. So what was your relationship with the community and early access like in regards to keeping them on that vision? We've spoken about their expectation as players, but what about expectations of people contributing to the game? Or did you have a back and forth with them? Did you sort of stay removed? What was your process of integrating and addressing that feedback and ideas?
Yeah, I've never promised or claimed to be bound in any sense to what people are suggesting or asking for.
Yeah, great.
I take the community as a source of information about how the game might be stronger. I think that there's the classic game design aphorism that, or principle that when people make a suggestion, generally it's not healthy to simply implement the suggestion. Usually you want to work backwards and figure out what is the experience that they had, which is causing them to make this suggestion, and then consider what the solution is to that experience. And sometimes they suggested the correct solution, but sometimes they're having a problem, and their way of reporting the problem is to suggest a solution to the problem. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes their solutions aren't really the best idea because they're not game designers, so they don't understand the trade-offs involved. Yeah. Right? People, or a lot of the time, players will be thinking in terms of the motivation that they have as people playing the game, which is distinct from the motivation of someone trying to design the game and improve it. When you're playing the game, you want to win, you want to gain power, you want stuff to be easier, essentially. And so a lot of suggestions, I would say the overwhelming majority, some on some level come down to, give me more ways to win easier, or like make this challenge go away, Now, simply doing that and giving them, following that as a design philosophy, it does work, but you essentially end up kind of in adventure capitalist land where you're just hammering rewards over and over as fast as possible, and you end up with this gigantic reward stack. Now, that's not a story generator at all. So it's not ever been a situation where I thought that I could negotiate anything with the community. I listen to people very carefully, but I also I read them a tremendous amount of feedback. I seek out feedback from very skilled players, people who know the game better than I do, frankly, and from people who are just starting out and total newbies. Try to get the whole spectrum of people, and I watch so much video of people playing the game in all sorts of different ways. Some people have wild modded playthroughs. Some people are playing on peaceful. Some people are playing the super hardcore playthroughs. And the process here is usually to simply ingest massive amounts of knowledge and information about how all these different people are playing the game. Take a crap ton of notes on things that went wrong, possible improvements, things that we could do better, places the game could be improved. And then on our end, as you mentioned earlier, I have the Google Doc of RimWorld ideas, and essentially it's things we could do to improve the game. And this thing is hundreds of pages long, and it includes basically everything I've ever come up with, or that our team has come up with as an idea for something to do, and it only grows. And there's a process of going through and comparing those ideas with each other in order to essentially have them run a sort of a bubble sort tournament where they're fighting to try to get to the top of the document. Mm-hmm. And when you have an idea on top of a 300-page document where it defeated every single other idea there, it's probably a pretty decent idea. Yeah. This is very distinct from the sort of pass-fail decision structure that I think is pretty common, where an idea will be suggested, and then on the spot or very soon, a decision maker has to be like, yes, it's a good idea, let's do it, or no, it's a bad idea, let's not do it. This is actually very pathological. It doesn't work because the choice is never between do this or do nothing. It's always between do this or do that, right? Yes. You're going to have those two things. It's actually not do this or do that. It's also do this or that or the other thing or this other thing, or really, to be honest, the actual entire universe of things that you could be doing, which is billions, billions, quadrillions of possible options.
Yeah, it's the classic saying yes to something is saying no to everything else for the
saying no to everything else, right? So once that's carefully acknowledged, it implies that the way to do that optimally is not to simply choose whatever sounds good and just go with that. It really is much more of a comparative process. First, ideating, developing, figuring out what my options even are, and then having a process of comparing them. And this is, sometimes it's even written analysis. I'll be like, hey, we could do A or we could do B. Each one's sort of a new feature. And I can sit there and write a half-page analysis of each one, pro, con, and I'll do that. And then figure out, oh, no, this one's actually not going to work because of this issue, which wasn't obvious on the surface.
Yeah.
But if we implemented this, it would cause this balance problem when it interacts with that quest. And there's really no way to solve that. So let's just not do it. You know, like I don't want to try to solve problems again. I just back out. I just do something else.
Yeah, it's not like you're short of ideas. You got 300 pages of them, right?
Yeah. So and like nothing's precious at all. So, that tends to be the process. Like I love the feedback, and we absolutely need it, and it's so motivating and so focusing. Like, you know, the stuff that you worry about before release is so different from the stuff you worry about afterwards. Players will tell you what to worry about. They won't necessarily give you the right answer and what exactly to do with it, but they'll tell you what they're concerned about. And it's not always obvious what that's going to be. You know, they tend to be concerned about what's actually happening in the game. They don't tend to be super concerned about superficial details. No one has ever complained because the characters don't animate in RimWorld. Yeah, even though it's just glaring omission. They don't have legs. They don't have arms. Like, it's ridiculous, actually. I'm just
the
like,
greatest trick the devil ever pulled, really.
Yeah, like the game will work. If someone complains, then maybe we'll deal with it. There's never been nary a peep about it. But like, you know, endless worries about why raiders come, and, you know, can we justify whether raiders come? And are the raids too hard? Or are they too easy? Are they too aggressive? Are they too soft? Like, these sorts of things, the things that players are pressing against, they're very, 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 very concerned about. And so those can bear a lot more design effort. So it's, you know, I don't use metrics. I don't track like, oh, how long did it take you to win this or that? Or how long did it take you to get this resource? You know, we don't gather data from players. It would be very difficult to gather that. It would be very difficult to interpret it because the game is so broad. I don't even know what the player is trying to do, much less how far along they are to do it. I can't detect most of the goals that players are trying to accomplish. Because they're
what's positive or negative about a particular delta of time doing something, right? Like,
it's like, how would you metricize that, right? For a game like Slay the Spire, or like very games with sort of start, middle, and end, where there's a sequence of challenges, again, a skill test, you can get metrics and get very meaningful information about that. But RimWorld is just, it's not even like a fan. It's like you just go in every possible direction and explore whatever you want in terms of play possibilities. So metrics aren't that useful. But I do read people's experiences. And what I ask them to do is tell the story of what happened in their own words. People give a suggestion, but it's very abstracted. It's just something they came up with after playing for 20 hours. But I'd rather hear about what happened there. Sometimes you can just watch them play for the video, but it can be a lot faster and more insightful to hear their story, because then the story tells you what they remembered, what they didn't remember, and what they were focused on. And when I hear their stories and I read the stories, then and I read a lot of them, not one person's, but a lot of them, and let them let your brain kind of see the commonalities and the themes and organize everything and take some notes. And there's this sort of process of absorption and synthesis that can go on to figure out what's important to people, and then to do the analysis of how to solve it. So that's kind of the process. That's the process of working with the communities, is essentially just drawing huge amounts of information from them. It's not so much of like a feature by feature negotiation on anything like that.
It's just very actively engaging with that information in your own process, it sounds like.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, I'm interested to hear, once you got to Steam and you have this huge flood of information that you're passing now and you're actively engaging with it, as we said, and that you're folding it into your process of like, okay, we've spoken about it being ideas or, maybe features or different things like that coming, or someone's having an issue with something. But can you remember from any part of the early access period, and particularly when it first interfaced with that new broader Steam community, because obviously the game was successful like pretty much straight out of the gate, you had a flood of new players. Can you remember any particular information that was coming your way or player feedback that had created a sort of profound realization for you, or was a bit of a watershed moment for the game's design? Or did things kind of just like, did you kind of get your aim on target right, and it was then just sort of heading towards that goal, and they were kind of the information was just tiny course corrections along the way? Or did you have like big watershed moments where you're like, oh shit, yeah?
There, honestly, it was one and then the other. So through the whole alpha beta period up to 1.0 release, this 6-year period, or the 5 years the game was on sale, we released every month or two. So it was really just taking small bites. Mm-hmm. And that let us stay very close to the feedback. And during that period, I don't think I was ever really blindsided by anything. Like, it was pretty smooth because we had good, like really good, close to the experience feedback, a lot of players, like enough players to really get the rounded sense of how lots of different people approach this experience, which is easy to miss when you don't have a large player count, at least a few thousand. So really, it was pretty smooth sailing for that time period. Then what happened afterward is we went dark for a while while working on the 1.1 update with the royalty expansion, which was our first expansion pack. Mm-hmm. And this is where stuff got difficult, because I was working on things, multiple steps of design without getting feedback from the community. And this is more risky and more difficult because I was so used to just getting immediate feedback on everything. I was never more than 2 months from the last version. So that's where I made a mistake. And that mistake was part of the royalty expansion. Basically, royalty was designed around the idea that you could do missions for this sort of powerful empire faction that was new for that expansion. And they would reward you by giving you these psychic powers, right? They'd give you your characters a royal title, which would give them, entitle them to have psychic powers, which would power them up. Mm-hmm. So it made sense that you would do something for the empire, and then they'd give you a title, and then you get the powers. But the powers were also quite advantageous on an ongoing basis. So we had to add some kind of trade-off for those, because otherwise there would just be too much power inflation. Yeah, it's always been kind of a struggle to make sure that the game remains somewhere close to human scale, and the player colony doesn't just power up like crazy very, very quickly. It's easy to do that by throwing rewards at the player. Everyone loves to get rewards, but they don't love it when the game falls apart an hour later because you're so overpowered, nothing makes sense anymore.
Yes.
So the trade-off that we released with at 1.1 was that essentially your guys would turn into assholes when they got royal titles. They would get really snooty, and they would need, they would demand nicer bedrooms, and they would demand all these special royal privileges, and be able to, they would want to play the harp and sit there on the throne, lording over people, and so on and so forth. And that was fine for a lot of players, but there was a really good chunk of the community who did not like this, because it triggered the sense that, here's my hero character, and now he's a jerk, and now I don't like him anymore. So it's taking your characters and making them unlikable, which was probably less of a concern if it's like StarCraft and it's not a character you're invested in. But as someone who's making a story generator, I made the mistake of trying to get players invested in this generated character and then turning that character into someone they don't like. So that was a lesson, and that was a problem. And people really didn't like that, actually, or some of them. And it was something I had to get solved. So I would say that was a mistake. Now, we did take a few months to sit down and redesign a different solution. So I actually ripped out that mechanic almost entirely and restructured the whole trade-off of the psychic powers towards this new meditation system. Characters, instead of being a jerk and lording over people and complaining all the time, they would meditate, and different types of characters had different forms of meditation. So they could meditate on the throne. Like you still had the throne because we had this mechanic of building throne rooms, and I didn't want to dump that. So they would use the throne to meditate, more like a Jedi temple sort of vibe than a King Farquaad or something kind of vibe. And they could meditate other ways too. They can meditate if they're an aesthetic. They could meditate staring at a wall. If they had certain traits like or backstories, like if they had a tribal backstory, they could meditate to natural objects like trees and so on and so forth. So it was just like a deep redesign of the whole trade-off structure of that mechanic. And that worked. But it was a mistake to get in there in the first place and make that error. And now that I know that error, I actually notice it in other places too. So I'm like a little touchy. It's one of those lessons learned is don't turn your characters into jerks.
Yeah, especially like you say, when the whole like thrust of your game's design is to get people invested in particular characters.
Like it's basic writing. Like I should have known that, right? Like you read a screenwriting book and it'll tell you like your character has to be kind of likable, or at least relatable. Yeah. Even if it's like a gangster who's a bad person, he's still kind of your gangster. You're like, he's the gangster you'd want to be if you're a gangster, and you're still kind of rooting for him. If he's just an ass and like a jerk to people, then eventually you're going to lose investment. So that's a basic storytelling principle. And I forgot about that and did not apply it. It did not manage to map that from writing like a screenplay onto designing this game. And it seems obvious in hindsight.
Well, that's one of the questions that I actually wanted to ask you, which is this is a perfect segue into really now. You kind of set me up for it. Is you've got these expansions that can be standalone, not from the base game, but you can have one expansion and not the others, right? But again, with the goal of your game and the vision of your design being a story generator, how do you go about, and especially now, and this is the segue jumping off from the last point, now that you've had this experience with royalty of taking a misstep there in that very specific way, like you say that, in hindsight, you're like, how did I even make that mistake? How did you go forward designing the other expansions, and how do you create expansions for a game like RimWorld where, you're not worried about the meta being some particular strategy of, finishing the game like, or, some dominant strategy like a cultural victory in Civilization, for example, but perhaps like a particular type of story that players get led down, right? And it's like, I didn't want that story for my characters. I wanted a different story, but now that I've got this expansion, it's pushed me down this path, or it's even taken on this kind of theme or these kind of tropes or something. How do you design expansions whilst maintaining that freedom of movement and expression with the player community and the systems?
Yeah. One of the early decisions I made on RimWorld, which we've always stuck with, is we're not trying to make it perfectly balanced in the mechanical sense. Yeah. So it's not an RTS game. Like if it was two players, they'd find some degen strategy and just hammer it over and over, and it wouldn't be very fun. It's not supposed to be balanced, and it's never going to be balanced. And it can't be balanced. The level of complexity and variation of what goes on can't make it balanced. That gives us a bit of freedom. The fact that a lot of the time players are kind of cooperating with us and trying to make a good experience helps a little bit. If it was multiplayer competitive, this would be completely different. A fundamentally totally different thing. Again, multiplayer competitive is always about winning and triumph and skill test and putting as much pressure on the mechanical systems as possible to get the result you want. And like figuring out how to trick those systems into doing what you want. RimWorld's not. It's more, it puts you under pressure, but it's also a toy. So it gives us a lot of freedom to add pathways through the game that the player can take, but doesn't have to. And that's more or less the approach that all the expansions have taken. They simply add more types of stories to experience, more mechanics, more types of characters, new game systems that let you change your character's belief, for example. Or, if you have royalty installed, you can interact with the Empire and pursue that path of getting power and having those stories and doing those quests, or you can just not. Like you can just ignore it and just do what you would ordinarily do, and it'll be the same base game with a bunch of extra content that won't fundamentally disrupt what you're trying to accomplish. So I think the overall approach has just been to preserve that core experience and add things that the player can do but isn't forced to.
Yeah, just to open up those range of options for them as the storyteller to move forward down that path. Do you find that players do engage with the game from more of a storyteller perspective or someone experiencing a story, like, the recipient of a story, or, is it a kind of a hybrid, like, say, players at a D&D table?
Yeah, breaking down a story in terms of its layers that way is interesting. I think you can look at the story events. Those are the things that happen in the game.
Yeah.
Then you can look at the story perceived, which is what the player notices and feels about. And then you can look at the story told, which is what the player would tell someone else if they were read it in a Reddit post or tell their friends. Those are largely three different things. So, yeah. I mean, what was the exact question again? I'm sorry.
Do you find players tend to, on like in the majority, engage with the game more as someone experiencing the story, or do they see themselves as the person crafting it?
Most players engage with it. In their mind, they're focusing on strategy and winning, as far as I can tell. Okay. So in the traditional sense, they have a goal, just like in StarCraft, like get more resources or something. And they're usually not sacrificing that goal for quirky story stuff that they want to do.
Yeah.
But the story will tend to happen to them anyways as they pursue that goal. And then they're engaging it in terms of their intent as a player who's trying to win. Although there's tremendous variation in this, right? So some people really are just going and trying to tell a cool story. But mostly they're engaging it as a player who's intending to win. They're motivated by the desire to win, by the desire to get more power, by the desire to get more safety. But then the pathway to doing that is them engaging with all of these story elements, knowing who their character is, for example. Like if you're going to use your characters effectively to fight, to farm, to trade, you got to know who they are. So you got to know all their traits. You got to know their names. You got to know their skills and their injuries. And that kind of automatically puts all that context in the player's brain. You got to know where your resources are. You got to know who you're trading with. You got to know who you're at war with. All those are the elements of the story. So players trying to win, and they're ingesting all this information into their mind. But then all that information is the stuff of a story, and I think it ideally, in sort of this apophenia process, automatically becomes this narrative thing where, they'll be just, they'll put the character in a room to kick their drug addiction, and they're just doing it because they want to, because it's the optimal thing, because they want to use that character as a sniper or something in the next year, and they'd rather they weren't addicted to that drug. But, when they think about it 5 minutes later, they're like, so Joe just like took, the drug addict guy that we just recruited and like threw him in the room, and it was kind of brutal. And now he's suffering. You can see, feel the emotion a little bit. You look at the text that says like what he was saying, or he was mumbling to himself in the room while he's going through withdrawal. So in some sense, you're kind of tricking players into experiencing these stories.
Yeah.
The capacity to notice these patterns of interaction and form a story from them is apophenia, and it's subconscious, automatic, and effortless. So people will tend to perceive it in the same way you perceive a smiley face out of two dots in a curve. But on so it's sort of a double layer psychology thing, right? On the surface, you're just trying to win, you're just trying to optimize, you're playing a strategy game, you're playing chess. But then what you perceive is this whole narrative arc of emotions.
Just through connecting the dots through the various events.
And that is effortless, Players not trying to do that. There's no effort in that. It's an automatic perception thing, like so much of cognition. Yeah.
Well, look, I want to pivot a bit and just wrap up today, spending a little bit of time just talking about, like Ludian Games and your studio, essentially. Because when you started, as you mentioned, you were one person prototyping some games and teaching yourself C#. Then you got Peter on board and some others helping you out. Now you're 20 plus people?
Yeah, it's the count is sort of fuzzy depending on who you count, but it's like 22 roughly, something like that.
So let's say 2022. That's like a mid-sized indie studio, right? So now you're a studio head as well. Talk to me about some of the sort of those, to use the term again, not to labor it, but like the watershed moments and, how your role and your approach to your process at Ludian has shifted over the years, scaling from one person to 20 plus.
Right. So one person was very easy and comforting. Right?
You like working with that one guy?
Yeah, he was great, easy to talk to. Communication was easy. Didn't have to really write much down. So, that was a cool time, but I was very limited in what I could accomplish alone, obviously. So hiring more people was fairly straightforward up to like 8 or 10, because like I said before, it's kind of me with help to do the stuff I'm trying to do, but I know everything that's going on. I can see everyone's task list. I can keep track of everything that's happening easily. And if need be, I can go in and take over for anybody. So there's no dependencies there. Where it started to get tricky is once you're passing 10, 15 people, now you need structure, and there's not actually a way to directly manage everything everybody is doing anymore. It became infeasible. And I would say that was the qualitative barrier that I had to get past. I knew that at the time. I knew that before it happened, and I certainly know that now. There's just a different way to run a studio when you have more people than you can keep track of exactly what they're doing all day, every day. And that way involves delegating and structuring and giving high level goals and vision, more than specific tasks and orders. It's no longer me making the game with people to take work off my plate. It's a group of people making the game, and I'm trying to like generally get them moving in a healthy direction. There's just a million sub skills that go into that. There's communication. There's figuring out what the right people are to hire to do that sort of thing. Like we're very asynchronous and we're all remote, which requires a certain type of person to work with. The kind of people who, need a whole lot of kind of backslapping and everyday motivation from external sources probably wouldn't work so well with us. But the kind of people who like to really drill into what they're doing, they do really well with us. But on my end, it's just been a transition to setting vision, setting direction, still enforcing quality, teaching people to do things as opposed to doing it myself. It's a very different job in a lot of ways. And that's a big learning process, but I've taken 10 years to do it, so I'm pretty comfy with that.
Looking back at that learning process and your transition from that solo dev who's on the tools, and then even in those small, before you hit that Napoleon's rule of 7, right? And communication is easy and seamless, and folks are easy, everyone's tasks are easy to keep in your head. And it can be sort of like, for want of a better term, like point and command style of management, if that's how people wanted to operate, whether you did or did not. And then you transition into this way, like you say, where you're empowering and delegating and other people are making the game and you're more sort of directing it. That learning process and going through that transition of over 10 years, it sounds like you engaged with it very thoughtfully, like with the book and like with RimWorld and everything. What were some particular resources or things that you did that maybe you could pass on to other studio heads who are going through that same process? I'm sure there are people listening to this right now that have a game that they're making with just a few people and feeling the need to scale, but are scared. Maybe they're at 7 and it's already getting a little unwieldy and they're struggling with being that new type of manager or that new type of process or figuring out how to communicate things. What were some resources? What were some helpful things that you did to actually see yourself through that transition?
I would say, obviously, the first most critical thing is to realize that barrier is there. And note it and take it seriously. Don't just, like, you hire one person, it's great. You hire a second, it's great. The third is great. The fourth is great. Like, you do the same thing over and over and it works fine until suddenly you're really stressed out because you got 12 people and you can't keep track of what they're doing. You feel like this cortisol pump in your body, your chest is tense, stuff's running off the rails, and everyone's asking you questions all the time and you're not in a sustainable state. Hard to get out of that too, because now you have to hire more people to solve that and learn new skills, but you're already overloaded. So the critical thing, I think, at that point is to hire people to take work off your plate in terms of running things instead of adding it. Take management work off your plate. And that is a different type of person, and it's a different type of hire, and it's a different type of relationship. Obviously, whoever the person running the studio is, whoever you are, is going to, your specific needs could be different, but maybe that needs to be an art director, or maybe that needs to be a design director or a technical director. And maybe this could be someone you promote from inside the organization into a position where they can kind of deal with a whole bunch of people and abstract them away from you. But it's straightforward, but essentially say, build a hierarchy and build that piece by piece so that you don't have more than, maybe 8 people talking to you, and ideally less. Obviously, everyone can talk to everybody. I don't cut off lines of communication, but in terms of I've set things up so I don't have to know what each programmer is doing. On our design team, we work on stuff using our own process, and we create designs and direction that way. And then the programming team has their own internal process of how they figure out how to execute that into the game and spread work out and fix bugs and go through those cycles. And all that's abstracted away so that I can actually focus on design and leadership of the company. So yeah, hire people. Hire people who take management work away instead of having it. Do that before you're overloaded rather than after. It's very stressful to do it after, I found.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's really great advice. I not just pushing through, but identifying and acknowledging that those transitions are going to be there and that things are going to change fundamentally, in regards to structure and delegation and even communication lines and things like that. With that multiplying complexity as you go through 7, 15 and more people. I had a very talented leader once say to me that there's no such thing as flat hierarchy in, a mid to large size studio. It's just invisible and visible ones. And, one of the things that we did at League of Geeks really early on was decide that we're going to have a very explicit visible one. And we did that from around 18 people, and it was a game changer. And it did, like you said, it didn't cut off lines of communication, but it just gave almost like irrigation, gave paths for the water to move through, and for communication to flow through.
Yeah. I still run a very high trust studio. So everyone is welcome to talk to anybody they want and draw on any resource they want. Everyone is a resource for everybody else. So if somebody needs something from somebody, then just tell them to do it and that they should do it. But there's in terms of habitual daily pathways of information flow, there's a defined structure to it. And that takes a lot of pressure and chaos out of the system, I think.
High trust studio is a great phrase. It's really, I really like that. Okay, well, look, I'm going to finish up with one question, which I've got to ask you. And funnily enough, I asked Tan and Zach this from, Bay 12, creators of Dwarf Fortress, when I had them on. And Boat Murdered was one of their answers. There was also a couple more. But in all the years of RimWorld, are there some particular stories, player stories that came about that just blew you away or surprised you or just elated, when you're watching these streams or videos that you've spoken about that just, you still remember to this day?
The Pete Complete playthrough of RimWorld, I think, is years old, but I think it's a very well-known one.
Which is, for our listeners who may not be familiar with it.
Sorry?
For our listeners who may not be familiar with it, what is that story? What happened?
It was so long ago.
Sorry, did you say?
Yeah, it's a whole playthrough there. So
okay, yep.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have it all crystallized at this point.
Yeah.
Beyond that, honestly, there's been so many. I ingest so much RimWorld, so many RimWorld playthroughs. The whole point is to structure it all in my head and find all the patterns and commonalities. So it's not. I can't say that there's one that really that really stands out over a 10-year time span.
Yeah, it sounds like you've created something that just kind of from the get-go in these small little ways provided some surprise and delight in the sense of achieving your goals of creating a story generator.
Yeah, it's not an incredibly, it's not the kind of story generator where totally wild and completely unpredictable stuff is happening. It's fairly controlled. It's fairly, from my point of view, it's fairly controlled and measured in some sense.
Yeah.
It's the kind where anytime you play, it's going to work out. It's going to create an experience that's interesting, that has a good balance of the variation and craziness, depending on the settings that you choose. And that's been the goal from the start. So that doesn't create a situation where there's one story that over 10 years or a year that is so completely crazy, aside from how it might be told. Usually they all kind of fit together and they make sense. But for any individual playthrough, there's a million possibilities. But they are within the genre of RimWorld stories.
And that makes sense, right, as well, because as you said from the start, your goal was to focus on this small ensemble of characters, right? Those personal, intimate stories, which then doesn't create some wild, Avengers Endgame style scenario, right?
Well, I mean, it can, right? Superhero stories do tend to have a certain arc. It's it's not a situation where the superhero quits usually in Marvel movies, the superhero doesn't like quit his job and like go work at a nursery, raising babies and then that's the end of the movie, right? Like it doesn't turn into that. It is always a story about someone who discovers special powers and then they deal with a bunch of challenges and then they learn how to do it. And then there's an enemy and then they fight the enemy and generally they win, or at least there's some continuation, right? And RimWorld is in that genre as well, or that scope of storytelling as well. The specifics are always different. It's always some player authored thing. You can win, you can lose, you can go fast, you can go slow, you can have a lot of people, you can have less people, but there's still bounds around it. And it's designed very carefully to have a certain consistency within that freedom, consistency around that freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Tynan, congratulations on your success in both, achieving this mighty goal of creating the story generator with your book, with the game. And thanks for the stories, I guess, both today and in RimWorld.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.